Okay, the question is it important that we should observe the sun, moon, and stars to mark the seasons? Now, what does Yahuwah's words say? These are but just a few of the many scriptures, because now I read scripture and I see calendar, counting, observing times, even the word time being mentioned all over. So it's important that we focus on his days, or that we get it right with these calendars. These are and then Leviticus 23, these are his feasts, even holy convocations, which we shall proclaim in their season. Deuteronomy 16 says to guard, set a hedge around. I think I went over this a little bit. To observe it can mean to guard and set a hedge around. So this is some of the Hebrew meaning behind that. The month of Abib. Keep the Passover unto the Lord thy God, for in the month of Abib, the Lord God brought us forth out of Egypt by night. Well, we know the month of Abib was the first month. We know that they had lambs. We know it wasn't in the winter time, just from the context of the story, or at least that's my understanding. So being the first month, we should assume that that's a springtime feast. But there's other places where you can pick it up on that Passover is a spring feast. And Sukkot is at the end of the year, end of the harvest, and that's a winter feast. So we're told to keep the feasts in their seasons, and to guard the month. And Jubilee 633 states, if we neglect to observe and to guard these months, or the month of Abib, then we're going to disturb their years, their seasons, and everything else. And that's what this change that the Pope did, that's what he's done to us, is made us forget our proper seasons. This is an excerpt from the Almanac, and here is the link to it. So you can go to, should be the page number itself, but you can search this Almanac. Now, this Almanac is distributed by the British Royal Crown Navy, I believe. It goes, it's tied to the Astronomical Time Division, and the U.S. Navy has hand in it too. And basically what they've done, my theory, or from the research, they use the Julian calendar to hide the true and correct date of things. So when you see a date, you have to ask yourself, well, which calendar is it on first? Because it's important, because it's a 13-day difference. So this is an excerpt from this almanac printed by the Navy in regards to the ecclesiastical calendars, which is our worship calendars, where we set our feast days. Now, religions around the world have their own worship calendar on their own, special feast days, whereas Yah has his. So in this particular one, if you can read this, the date of Easter determines the dates of most of the movable feasts in Christian ecclesiastical calendars. This almanac was written in 1960. During the early centuries, the Christian era had many diverse practices. So basically at the Council of Nicaea, they were trying to get everybody together at the 325 Council of Nicaea. And it eventually became generally accepted until the Gregorian Reform in 1582. So in 1582, basically how I read this is March 21st on the Gregorian calendar was adopted as the date of the vernal equinox. Well, how can they adopt a date for it? I thought it happened on a specific date, and maybe that's not the date. Anyway, pardon me?
Good question.
Yes.
I don't see how they can set a date for that, if that's an astronomical.
Yes, and they did. And when you read this almanac, there's lies embedded with the truth, so you have to read between the lies. And to do that, you have to have a good understanding about how the Julian calendar operates, which they explain in the almanac also. So everything I'm saying, you can go back to the almanac and do a word search on it, and find pretty much what you're looking for, where the Julian calendar has a certain way of keeping time, which is 365.25. And then they actually have 3 other ways to keep a yearly time, and one of those is the Gregorian calendar, which is less than 365.25. And the two others I haven't even explored. So keeping time is like, I'm like in preschool or maybe a 2-year-old class, and it's like a PhD type subject is what I found. And everywhere you look, there's more places to look with more things to look at on counting time and how they've messed it up. So does Yahuwah tell us how to tell proper time so that his feast calendar is started in the correct season according to his instructions? And again, these are just a few verses out of many scriptures inside and outside the canon. Genesis 1:14, the very first, when he made it on the fourth day, he lists all three, the lights in the firmament, and all three are for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And this took me a while to make the connection, and they are. I see the patterns now, but somewhere, somehow they got divided to where we were just looking up at one or two of them and in the wrong order. So I'm going to try to use scripture only to put them back in order according to scripture. So all three luminaries, sun, moon, and stars, are used for signs and seasons, which basically keep time. So think of a time clock or a watch. You have, you know, we have our three hands on a watch. Well, those are the three hands in the sky is what makes up the whole watch. And if you set his times to one or the other, then you're missing out on the correct days because they don't all have the same circuit. Anyway, it's amazing how it fits up there. So Jubilees 2:9, God appointed the sun to be a great sign on the earth for days and for Sabbaths and for months and for feasts. And I believe this is the text that most used for the equinox. At least that's what I was doing. And I'm not a scholar with all of the information in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I haven't read it all over the years. So I'm going back to look at those. But it is the great sign. But then you go to Enoch in 74:12, depending on which version you're reading. It could be 72:12. It says the sun and the stars bring in all the years exactly, so that they do not advance or delay their position by a single day into eternity, but complete the year with perfect justice in 364 days. And this used to hang me up because we always have that 1¼ days extra per year. Well, then it finally hit me. Yah's feast calendar is a 1 through 364 day, but that's not the civil solar sidereal calendar that you use for businesses.
Exactly.
So the two have to kind of fit together.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's
yes.
That's hard for people to get around right there.
It
we're
really
dealing with
is.
a liturgical calendar, a festival calendar, instead of what we're used to as secular calendars.
Correct. And it's an ecclesiastical calendar, and it is only 364 days, and then you tick off a week until you start it again. Every 5 to 6 years is what I've found so far, but again, I'm still learning on this. So Enoch just told us the sun and the stars bring in all the years. So then I started looking for the stars and which star is it? And to make a long story short, they kind of told us, which basically was the first point of Aries. However, when they made the calendar change that I showed you previously in those 3 columns and realigned everything, they basically moved the first degree Aries from where it was around 4849 Gregorian back to 321 Gregorian. So they say the sun enters Pisces or enters Aries on March 21st Gregorian. Well, that's not real time. That's their fake time. And they basically fomented the lie of precession and how now the sun is floating backwards and doesn't keep right time. And so the sun is coming up in these different constellations. Well, I'm kind of simple. So I'm looking at Stellarium and I'm looking, you know, at their zodiac and trying to put it together. And anyway, it finally hit me like a ton of bricks. oh, they've just told us the sun rises in Aries on March 21st, but it really doesn't. Just like they've told us a lot of things that really wasn't true. Um, and that's my supposition. And however, looking through this, found something interesting along the way, which is Great Britain always started spring on 325, but this was based on the Julian calendar, and that is 4/7 Gregorian, still to this day. The Jews have a feast every 28, not that they still use 325 to this day, but this is still the springtime start. It hasn't changed. The time hasn't changed. The Jews also found a feast that they celebrate every 28 years called Birkat Hakama. And this is based on a 4/8 Wednesday start, except they started on Tuesday the night before. So I don't know how that works because I start in the day, and if you start in the evening, that's fine. Then you just got a longer Sabbath, which is great. Sometimes I do too. There is a link further below with more details on this celebration, but it's once every 28 years, and it always happens on a Tuesday night of 4/7 into a Wednesday 4/8, and it's called the Blessing of the Sun. And this particular celebration is basically when the Jews say that this was the very first day, not the first day of creation, but it was the fourth day when the sun and the luminaries were put in the sky. That's what they're celebrating. They're at their exact same position that they were back then on this date every 28 years. And so 2009, the funny thing is they don't know why they celebrate this, but 2009 was the last year they had this celebration, and 2037 is the next year that they have this celebration. So this was another proof text about a first degree Aries being moved, and which I was able to find an article where it used to be, which is where it still is today on the Eastern Orthodox religions, which is how I know it hasn't moved in 2,000 years, because they still recognize the same sign, because his clock doesn't change. And I'm sorry to keep repeating that, but it took me a while to realize his clock doesn't change. And he told us that with his work. So Psalm 89:37, it shall be established forever as the moon is it shall be established forever as the moon and as a faithful witness in heaven. So the moon is a faithful witness. He appointed the moon for seasons. The sun knows he's going down. Well, in Enoch, it mentions that the moon has 4 names, which I equate that to 4 seasons, whereas the sun has 2 names, which is summer and winter, is what I understand it as. And so then that let me know that the moon marked the seasons. So I started marking these constellations and where the moon was when it was dark and light, dark and full. And I started to see a pattern there. So we don't use the moon to start the year, except it is a faithful witness. So it is used, but it's not the first or the second driver to start the year. And it's not recognized to start the months either, because it only has a 354-day circuit. And we're forbidden by the word not to use the moon because it comes in 10 days too soon from year to year. And then again, if you do, your years will confound you, and it'll disturb the seasons and the order and all of that. And he even tells his children that this is what's going to happen. They will forget, and it will be disturbed. So that's where we're at now, and that's why we're all trying to unwind ourselves from the lies to crawl out into the truth. So the moon is a faithful witness and not the first or second driver. He told us earlier that the sun was the first, and then the stars. So the sun and but together they brought in all the years, and the moon would be a faithful witness.
Well, that makes sense.
Yes, and I can show all of this on a spreadsheet once I go through this, and people can ask questions too. So I know someone had asked that where's Aries mentioned in scripture, and it's not. But through research, even just pulling it up, hey, which sign is the first spring constellation, everyone says Aries. It's that's just the way it's been throughout history. And so that's why Aries became the sign for spring. However, there is a Josephus text in here that I'll get to where he actually specifically mentions it. Now, I don't know how people feel about that. I was just using it. I just came across it and was like, oh, wow, thank you. And so
Angela, you want to
yes,
take a
sir?
question?
Sure.
Okay. David Jones raised his hands, and here he comes.
Go ahead.
David, if you're there, go ahead. I must have pushed the wrong button. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. Very good. Very good. Can you expound a little bit on the moons, the witnesses of the moon? I did a little research last night and today, and I've heard and been told that every 3 years, like this year, I believe it was, if you went by the date that you guys are talking about, the moon was full on Passover. And I believe that is a cycle, but I'm not understanding completely the cycle, the 3-year cycle. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yes, it's actually, there's a 3-year cycle mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I have marked on Yah's calendar, where I did it 1 through 364, where it talked about full and full moons in the first, second, and third years. And the moon doesn't just have a 3-year cycle. So for a number of years, I was trying to match it up to the moon cycles. And just after a certain amount of time, I'd done over 50 years, which isn't a lot, but it is for me because I don't know how to, I'm only a basic user in Excel, a little bit better than basic. I do accounting. And so I can't do data dumps and don't have the patience to learn those kind of things on the full and dark moon. So I was having to do it one at a time. And after a certain amount of time, the full and dark moons or the full moon patterns just didn't match up anywhere. And so what I have found now, though, after aligning it correctly, is it goes back from full to dark. So where you'll have a full moon in, say, year 1, then there's patterns where it'll be a dark moon in year 1 on the first day of the first month. Actually, I think the 31st day of it, the last day of the year, if I'm remembering it correctly. So the pattern is that if you start your year correctly, your moon will be dark in Aries in the first month every year. And that's what I found on the patterns. And then it'll be dark in each subsequent month after that. However, because of its 354 cycle, it does skip. And I haven't found that skip yet, so I'm still researching it. But so far, the moon is in Aries on that first month. And the eclipse is a good example because on April 8th this year, and it actually was telling me to go ahead and make sure, I was checking intercalation schedules and making sure it was correct. The dark moon on 4/8 was in Pisces. So the new year started that Wednesday. And the dark moon matches the moon cycle only in reverse from the Dead Sea Scrolls, if that makes sense. I hope I'm saying that right.
Thank you.
I hope I didn't confuse you anymore, but I do address it later too. So what does Yahuwah say about using the luminaries outside his instructions? Deuteronomy 4:19, and this verse is repeated several times, and I think even in the prophets, or maybe even in Enoch and Jubilees. He tells us not to lift up our eyes into heaven so that we see the sun, the moon, and the stars in the host of heaven and be driven to worship them and serve them. Well, I didn't know. I was like, I don't serve the moon or the sun. I serve Yah. Well, when someone did a lunar study and that I came across and broke these words down. And when we use the luminaries outside of his instructions, they're serving us in the feasts through the Levitical service. And this is the Strong's number down here, and I've highlighted that area. So you can look that up too and verify that. So worship doesn't just mean, you know, false worship. Well, it is false worship, but that's how important it is to make sure we're doing this correctly. And I'm still may not be doing it correctly, but I am searching, and this is one of the reasons why too. So all Gentile religions look up to use the equinox, the moon phase, or stars in an order outside of Yahuwah's instructions. So as the sun first is a great sign, which I think is the equinox, or that shadow of turning. I don't want to call it the equinox yet because I'm not sure. They've messed with the definitions. So the shadow of turning, where temples were set, I think that was a sign, hey, spring's coming, get ready. But then you have to wait, and you wait on the stars. And if we were trained in that instead of driven away from it through fortune telling, then we would know to be able to look up and know how to tell time, because the ancients did. They were very familiar with it. And then they'd know how to set their feasts. So all the pagan religions, they use things outside of their order. Yah's instructions are telling you, no, do it this way. My feasts are based on time, which includes all three. And that's just my understanding, and I am open for correction. And then again, he says, don't learn the way of the heathen or the nations in Jeremiah 10. And then he talks about what I think is maybe a Christmas tree. I don't know. Another one in the Testament of Naphtali, he says the sun, moon, and stars don't alter their order, so thus we shouldn't either. The Gentile nations, because they wandered astray and forsook Yah, have changed the order and have devoted themselves to stones and sticks, which is how most people measure the equinox shadow. And I didn't realize doing this calendar study how many pagan worshipers there are around the world that worship on 3/21, 6/21, 9/21-ish, and then 12/21. You know, and they're not worshiping Yah. They're going to these temples and bowing down. Some of them make snake shadows and stuff too, I think down in Mexico. So he's telling us not to be that way. And then in James 1:16 and 17, he says he's the father of lights. It comes from above, and there's no variableness. And it doesn't necessarily mean this, but I'm asking maybe moon phases, because people's moon or the full moon are neither shadow of turning. And this is what I've heard called the equinox. So then he does tell us through his word, don't look up and do it like the nations. Be different, you know, and worship me on my days. So when does spring start according to history and currently? And then I said, please read between the lines when researching it. When you do research on these terms, equinoxes and solstices, and doing an research, you'll have to read between the lines. And just set things aside if they don't make sense. I do know that they use the Tekufa and the equinox interchangeably and confuse the definitions. The same applies to solstice and two new words I found, which was ephelion and perihelion. From my understanding, a solstice is the same as ephelion and perihelion. It's just ephelion is when the sun is at the highest or the furthest north, and perihelion is when it's at the furthest south. So it breaks it down between north and south. In Antiquities of the Jews, this is Josephus. In the month of Xanthicus, which actually is the first month when you look it up, which is called Nisan by the Jews. It's the beginning of our year on the 14th day of the lunar month of Aries, because the moon is dark, and that names the month too, although obviously it wasn't Aries, that's a pagan name. Tali is the Hebrew, I believe. The dark moon marks the months. And this is if I'm correct. Again, still up, I'm still researching it. It says when the sun is in Aries. So he's just named the lunar month of Aries when the sun is in Aries. That's when they, on the 15th day of the same month, when the season of the year is changing from winter, the law enjoins us. Oh, this is a separate one. I'm sorry. Did I not copy the second part of this verse? Basically, you can look it up and go see the rest of it. But he says this is when they have the Passover, when the sun is in Aries. And this is actually named in Josephus. The red marks are mine added. Here's the second one in Josephus talking about Sukkot being in the wintertime. So this is how we know from, yes, an outside source that Passover is spring and Sukkot is winter. The blue highlights from the almanac states that spring started every year in Great Britain on March 25th, which is Julian, which when you convert it, it's April 7th Gregorian. And you can read this text because it has all kinds of calendar changes, when it changed and what dates it changed from, so you can back that into. Can we prove when spring occurs by the sun, moon, and stars? And then what is the definition of a tekufa, an equinox, a solstice, a phelion, and perihelion? And what are these definitions? Are they being used interchangeably? Have the definitions changed? So the equinox is when the sun passes the equatorial line of 0 hours and 0 degrees. And I put on near 3/7 Julian, which is 3/20 Gregorian. And you can find that information with the 0 hours, 0 degrees within this text that's highlighted. It's tiny print, but you can go to the link and look it up too. And you'll see a Julian date. So all throughout this book, they use the Julian dates, and then they give you all these mathematical computations and big words, nutation and precession of the equinoxes, and you know, because they're telling you how to fix stars through their lives so that you can do navigation. That's just my understanding. Okay, this is the Gregorian equinox date for 2024, which happened March 19th this year. And it's always March 19th, 20th, and then which is also March 6th, 7th, Julian. This is when the sun passes the 0 hours, 0 degrees mark. When you zoom in on this, you'll see these two blue lines, and that's the 0 hours, 0 degrees. And then the sun is actually in Pisces. This is a video I was watching, and I can't find the link right now, but this text here referenced Constantine back in 321, and it was Dies Sol, which is the equinox, and occurred March 7th, and that's what is within this text. And it still occurs the same Julian date today. That's how we know time hasn't changed. So they say the Julian calendar wasn't keeping proper time. It just wasn't keeping the time they wanted to. And March 7th, 321, it's still March 7th, 1960 from the almanac up here when the equinox occurred. And it within a day or two, which is 320 Gregorian. Here was another video I saw with the same information. So the Tekufa, I've always known it as the term of the year or season. Per the screenshot below, the Aries, which is what they say happens March 21st, that doesn't. And they've changed the star names. They've changed the star names also, so it's called Zeta Piscean. And this occurs every year, 4/7 to 4/10-ish, where the sun actually passes this sign, and it just depends on if it's a leap year or not. This is the ancient first degree Aries, and you can read it in this text and go search it on the net, but it's also still and this is a Hindu, ancient Hindu, but which is Eastern, Middle Eastern, but they still do it today, and it's still first degree Aries today, according to the almanac when you do the math. This is stellarium showing the sun in Zeta Piscium on 4/8, which was the eclipse date. And when you zoom in, you can see that the sun is before Zeta Piscium. And this is actually when the eclipse passed over the US. So he was still in Pisces, the sun was. Now, the ancient lamb actually had an outstretched foot that touched this cord, which is why Aries started at this point. So they've redrawn the constellations a little, which is also another lie you have to wade through, and rename these stars for their benefit so that we would lose the story, because the story is written above us. If we knew all the names of these stars, it would map to the scriptures and we would know exactly what was going on. Here's another proof text that I'm using. August 4th, 70 CE was the 9th of Av, according to the screenshot below. This is a Julian date because the calendar hadn't changed yet. That was in 1582. So this is an actual date from back in the day. This date actually corresponds to the 9th of Av on the 2024 calendar that started on 4/10 this year. Okay, what is the solstice, aphelion, and perihelion? Are they the same definition? And then from the research and the definitions, to me, it appears they are the same. Solstice is when the sun is furthest north or south from the center of the equator. They also use terms like when it's the highest north or highest in the sky or lowest in the sky to kind of muddy the waters. Well, I came across these terms on an app and I kept seeing these different dates for these two terms. So when I looked them up, they also have the same definitions. The sun is furthest or highest north of the center, and it occurs every year on the same dates. And then perihelion, it's the lowest. It's when it's in wintertime, and it occurs the same days within days every year, which is in January. And this is the link to this excerpt down here. And when you read this in yellow, it describes the definitions the same as these, and it does something else. It says 4 principal positions on the ecliptic, which marks the limits of the 4 seasons. That means it's at its furthest limit and it's getting ready to change from one season to the next. When the center is at the extremity most remote from the sun, or aphelion, it is the summer solstice. So he just referenced aphelion to the summer solstice. Now, I don't know what year this goes back to, but it's at the Gutenberg.org. And looking at it, it looks like it's a fairly old history type book. And then it says that opposite perihelion also calls it the winter solstice. So this got me thinking, well, they're using them interchangeably. And so the dates they give us for these, which date is it? Is it a Julian date or is it a Gregorian date? And then once you have the solstices, aphelion and perihelion, you can back into the 2 middle points or equinoxes or tekufas, depending on if an equinox is the tekufa. And that was 4/10 and 7/10 this year from the aphelion and perihelion dates that I had this year. So this is the app. It's called Lunar Soul Cal on an Android phone. And it tells you the position of the sun and the moon throughout the year. And if you zoom in, you'll see next aphelion date, July 5th, I believe is what I'm reading. And then next perihelion, January. And when you break down the word itself, it means furthest north and furthest south. And then here's the dates for the solstices for the same year. The Gregorian solstice dates of 6/20 and 12/21 don't match the aphelion dates of 7/5 and perihelion date of 1/4, or do they? Here's a screenshot of my spreadsheet. I'm a visual color person to find patterns. And when you zoom in on this, this is your Julian count of days. And then this is the Gregorian count of days. And this is Yah's day count, and then days of the week. When you zoom in on these orange parts, these are aphelion, and I can't read it now, but basically when you zoom in and look across, the aphelion date was the same date, Julian 621, is what they said the solstice was.
Will you send this document along so I can pass it out?
I don't mind doing that, but a word of caution, because I've been using this and just adding to it and redoing it for years. And so it has a lot of notes on it and possible this and maybe that. So I might have marked something as a feast or something because I wanted to go back and look at it later. That's not necessarily a feast. It's not as clearly understandable, if that makes sense. But I don't mind sharing it if people just know, don't take it as gospel and do your own research on it.
Right.
Because I could be wrong on some or all of it, but I don't mind sharing it at all.
This is just massive information that's going to, well, for me, it would take me quite a while to discover all that you're talking about, but how intriguing, very intriguing.
Well, you know what? All praises to the Father, because I couldn't do this on my own. He showed me really every step of the way. I'm one of these that gets frustrated if I spend more than about 10 minutes on something and can't find what I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So he showed me a little bit at a time, and I was kicking and screaming the whole way, because I did well in school, but I hated projects and putting stuff down on paper. That's not my strength. And teaching is really not my strength. I tend to wander off too much. Shiny squirrels and stuff come along. But anyway, so I checked these on the aphelion side. Now, sometimes it was a day or two off, and that could be the difference in the time zones because of how they muck up the time. But basically, when you had aphelion, it was close to or corresponded with what the solstice date was that year. It was a Julian date that they gave us. And so you don't know what calendar it goes to, and it makes a difference because there's 13 days difference between the two. I do say it later and have a link, or maybe it was earlier. If you got a Gregorian date, subtract 13 days, and that'll give you the Julian date. If you think it's a Julian date, add 13 days, that'll give you the Gregorian date. And perihelion was the same, where it matched the solstice, either on the day or within a day or two. This is all about the Birkat Hakama, and it's celebrating the Tekufa, Jewish. I'm not Jewish, but I love my brother Judah, and they have a lot of information that I found along the way with this. I know that just like all of us, we're all kind of in darkness trying to find our way out. I don't subscribe to Judaism, though, at all. So I say that not meaning in a bad way at all, because I think some of their, the way they do things, I've been to Israel 3 times, and I just fell in love with the place and with the people. They're just amazing. But Judaism never appealed to me. So I was listening to you earlier, and I do try to follow all of Scripture. But I have learned a lot from my brother Judah also. I don't discredit them at all, if that makes sense. And I don't read the Talmud or the Mishnah or anything like that. So this one I have already explained a little bit, that it was celebrated the last in 2009, and it's every 28 years. Here's a little excerpt from it, the Wikipedia article, which it is in the Talmud, so maybe I should have read it more just to pull information down, because there's truths hid all over the place. That it was a tradition the sun was created on its vernal equinox position at the beginning of springtime in the lunar month of Nisan, and it gives you a date of March 25th, Julian, and then the I can't say the word, vernal equinox historically fell out on March 25th every year. Julian, they just told us. This equinox now falls 17 days after the true equinox. Okay, this is a perfect example of how they hide things. They slightly add a word in this case, true equinox, as opposed to just equinox. And so now these two equinoxes are 17 days apart, with the error increasing because the the Gregorian calendar doesn't intercalate like it should, which is about a day every century. So they just told us here, and when I did the math between March 20th and you add 17 days, you come to the Julian date of March 25th, if that makes sense. Or yes, or April 7th, Gregorian. And I explained this also in the red letters here. I don't know how to get that off. There we go. So basically, they have two vernal equinoxes, and they're in two different places, is what I got out of this article. And then here it explains about the Tukufa and the solstices, which it doesn't, don't believe it really mentions the equinox. It's been a minute since I've looked at some of this, but it was good information. Again, the article equates Tukufa with the equinox and solstices according to the selection above, compared to aphelion and perihelion interchangeably. Vernal equinox, of course, occurs in the spring. It's a Latin word and it means equal night. And then the sun passes the equator at 0 degrees in the Pisces winter constellation. This was another proof that they've just told us they've moved it and it's in Pisces in winter. And then I said many temples are set to magnify this sign, and they've been built for thousands of years, and they still measure the same shadow year after year. So that lets me know time hasn't changed. This was something a little fun that I found, but that I came across when I was reading, because after looking at constellations for so long, I was thinking, I remember Yahusha saying something about a man with a water pitcher, and somebody equated that to Aquarius, which is he's the man, he's the water bearer in the heavens. So if the gospel's written in the heavens and Messiah mentions it, I went back and looked it up and then tried to match it to the heavens. And basically his disciples said, they asked, where shall we keep the Passover? Well, it was like he told them when to keep the Passover. So he says, you'll meet a man bearing a pitcher of water, follow him, and wheresoever he shall go, say ye to the goodman of the house, where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples. He shall show you a large upper room furnished and prepared. There make ready for us. And then in Luke, behold, when you've entered into the city, there shall be a man meet you bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house where he enters in, or they've also said turns into. And he shall say to the goodman of the house, the master says unto thee, where's the guest chamber where I shall eat the Passover? And he shall show you a large upper room furnished. There make ready. Well, every year, there's this sign in the heavens that I think is the spring marker with macabre. This macabre means the leader or the first to come out in a troop, I believe. It's difficult finding these meanings, and I just recently started looking into this, so my memory is not very good on it. I'm continuing research. But basically, this is Aquarius with the water pitcher. He's looking this way, and on April 9th, it's not Passover yet. This, I believe, is the beginning of the year, but it's telling him when to get ready. As the days tick off and gets later in the year, which Passover was April 23rd, you see more and more of this sign appearing in the early morning hours right before dawn. And this upper room appears, which is right above your Pisces. So these are called chambers or guest houses or houses even. At least that's what I know them as in astrology, but it also seems to be what it is in Yah's term, but maybe he calls them windows. So like you were saying yesterday, these are the windows of heaven. So follow the goodman of the house, or follow the pitcher where he turns into, ask him where the upper chamber is to prepare Passover. By the time Passover rolls around, this is pretty much what you see in the early morning skies, and it's just up further. You see the whole thing. It really looks pretty. I'd like to see it one day in real time, but I'm not in that kind of an area right now. So this, I was saying, hey, that's close to the first start of the year too, but y'all be the judge and decide that. This will tell you also when Aquarius is visible. It's very difficult when you do these searches, because this is why they're trying to hide it. They don't want us to know. But like when you say, when does Spica rise, or when does this star rise, you can never find that out. And I think that's because that's how the ancients told time. They would get up early in the morning before sunrise, look at the morning sky, and then also look at the evening sky, because Abraham was always sitting at his tent door in the evening. That's just my guess. But they looked at the sky a lot, and you can only look at it at the nighttime. It's only visible at nighttime because the sun blocks it out during the day. So does the barley harvest tell us when spring is? I actually included this. I went back and found it. Here is the letter from the ministry. Now this is, I don't subscribe to, I don't know what this site believes on anything else. I just came across this in my studies and had kept it. But basically it goes through the whole process that barley has been genetically modified. This is from the agricultural person over agricultural in Israel in the 80s, and said that barley used to be harvested late April, early May at the very earliest. And that would actually fit in with the intercalation schedule in an April start of 4/8 or later on Wednesday, on that Wednesday. So here to sum it up, it appears that the equinox on 3/20 Gregorian is not the Tekufa or the first day of spring. This is just my research and what I've come to. And now I don't even think it's necessarily the equinox. It's just what they've assigned to that sign that happens on that date. So I don't know what that sign is. It happens. That's just how they've hidden everything. So basically it goes through how they're trying to hide things on telling time, because they want us to miss our feast. And that's how important it is to make the wedding feast, because I believe that we're kept out of Yah's wrath if we make that wedding feast. Here's some other stuff. Tekufa, first or last day of the season. I just came across this and I added it. I haven't researched this a lot, but I think that was leading into what you were talking about too, with some type of a Sunday, but then you wait until Wednesday type thing. So I'm not going to teach on this because I don't know, but this is an ancient Maseroth. And having been in Israel, and I was blessed enough to be able to go down to all of these different churches and synagogues. The sad thing is at that time I was taught that it was pagan worship that they were already doing just a short while after Yahusha's death. However, now I know it wasn't pagan worship they were doing. It was how they count their feasts. They're an agricultural society, and it's, if you plant your seeds too early, your crop's not going to be good. So with everyone using a March 21st as springtime, I know this from my friends who are gardeners. You know, I think this year they pretty much lost everything because all the storms came in April and washed it out. So that's why it's so important to follow the timeline correctly, being an agricultural society. And so it goes a little bit more onto that. It talks about the Tekufa marks the last day of the season according to this. Let's see what else. I did mark the Tekufa according to the mosaic. So I went kind of and matched up Pisces and Aquarius. And the angel here is just a little bit offset. And when you're looking at this too, whichever sign the sun is in, you can't see it because the sun is in that sign. So you can only see what's behind him in the early morning hours after he goes a certain amount of distance. Or you can see after the sun sets, you can see things starting to come out of the tabernacle at heaven. So the ancients had to be very aware of how this was to know if the sun's in Pisces or here, that this is what you should see in the night sky at certain times opposite. So then they could read what was in the day sky by knowing what was in the night sky, if that makes sense. Oh, it also says it's engraved and ordained in the heavenly tablets. I've actually, I think Zeta Piscium is one. And I just, yeah, I think revealed another star in Gemini that's called 44 Genorium. And it actually occurs on the aphelion date every year, 7/6, without fail. So I'm starting to go back and mark these. And so that's why I said telling time is just a very intricate subject. But once you have the start date of either, I'm leaning towards a 4/8 Wednesday start and later, I can see an argument for 4/7 start. So that will change your weeks at the beginning or the end, depending on your intercalation schedule. But again, I'm still studying on this. So that's why I'd like more eyes to look at it and add in some more smartness because I've about reached it. So there's some more links and stuff, and that's it. I hope I haven't lost everybody.
No, but as I said before, you certainly intrigued me. And I think what we need to do actually is you and I, Angela, get together and do a summary. Now that we got the whole thing, just to summarize, because, you know, we had to get to the end before we knew what date you were pointing at. And finally, that was very satisfying to know. But if we could get a summary, then let's do it in the next week or so.
If you can tell me exactly what would be easiest or most beneficial, then I can definitely, yes.
Sure.
What that entails. Yes.
And
now this, go ahead.
I was just going to thank you so very much for sharing your heart with us.
Oh, you're welcome.
That took an awful lot of work, not just the research, but to share it and share it publicly to the few people that are very interested in that. And the people here, if you have insights at any place in this document or this lecture, please let me know. I can get questions answered and so forth. But I think probably you might want to take a look at this when I send it to you, so you can get enough information to ask a good question. And I want to thank you all for coming. I really do. These are important. And these YouTubes with a 364-day calendar get a lot of downloads, a lot of views. So we're looking forward to that here too. And Angela, you got the last word?
Well, yes, I know, I don't know if there's any questions that anyone has, but I just wanted to tell everybody that Shavuot, based on this count, is actually this Sunday. And there's a sign in the heaven where the sun, Venus, and Mercury is all in Gemini. And Gemini, we've all been told, are twins. But I've also heard that it is the bride and the groom. So it's a sign of a wedding. So I've started to kind of match up these conjunctions in these signs to see if they line up to Yah's feast days. And so Shavuot is this Sunday, if anyone would like to go out and check it out, and if they're interested in it only.
Oh, definitely, definitely.
I know many people have kept it already.
So I'll check you out later. And anything that has to do with this, I'll send you an email about. Thank you for coming. Yahweh bless you all.